Please join me in welcoming Professor Moran.
Thank you, Kate. This is going to be a more informal event than I had originally anticipated, but I can still go through the basics. So what the problem is in dealing with the evolution-creation controversy is understanding what evolution is all about. A lot of people, there's a famous quotation that it's a takeoff on Richard Feynman's quotation that if you think you understand quantum mechanics, then you don't. If you think you understand evolution, then you probably don't either. So it is a complicated topic, but we can simplify it as long as let's work together through some simplified concepts of evolution, namely what evolution is and how we distinguish between evolutionary facts and evolutionary theories, and that will really help us to progress when it comes time to looking at the evolution creation controversy. We may actually have a hand for you.
Yep, that's all flicker. And then get rid of the lights that are shining directly on it. Yes.
You okay if we turn the lights down?
We might be in business.
And you will use the mic?
And I will use the mic as best I can, as long as I can get it pointed at me. Sure, there are people at the back who will probably yell at me if they can't hear, right?
We're yelling right now.
So I'm counting on you.
Yeah, okay.
You're the test case here. So I want to thank the University of Toronto Secular Alliance and also Centre of Inquiry. And the topic of my talk is, gee, I don't know what it is because I can't read the damn thing up here. So I guess we're going to be winging it in terms of speeches.
Do you need a little light for your notes?
Yeah, sure, would be nice to see.
Want one of those?
We're going to talk about evolution. We're going to talk about evolution as a theory and a fact. And it's, as I said, it's a little bit complicated. It's a little bit frustrating at times. It's a little bit frightening at times. We start off with a slide showing the difference between the scientists, the geologists, astronomers, biologists, and physicists who are excited about nature and anxious to grapple with mysteries of the unknown. And then in the fifth panel, of course, the young Earth creationist, who's just very frightened and confused about it all and turns to God for help. So there's a big difference between the way scientists think about the unknown and discovery and the way the average person thinks about it. Now, as a scientist, I'm very comfortable talking about biology, biochemistry, and chemistry, and I'm a little less comfortable talking about things outside my discipline. So I actually understand some of this aspect. my daughter, my daughter's an astrophysicist. So when she starts talking about causes of gamma ray bursters or cosmology or stuff like that, I sort of nod my head and go along. But I, quite frankly, really don't understand relativity. I don't understand tensor calculus and other sorts of things. She thinks I'm pretty stupid. I guess most children think their parents are stupid. But she doesn't understand evolution. Okay, so I'm a little comforted by the fact that I know my field, she knows her field. The problem is that all the rest of you, all the outside world, it's really, really hard sometimes to understand what these complex topics are all about. So my goal here is to simplify it enough so that you have a good grasp of the scientific meanings of evolution and meanings of what's known and what's unknown, and that will help you to sort things out when you come to some of these debates. So let's skip over this and let's go right to the little controversy that happened last month with Jim Watson. Some of you might know Jim Watson. He's Watson of Watson and Crick that discovered DNA. And he made some comments a month ago about blacks being less intelligent than other races, and that therefore he despaired about the future of Africa. And here's part of what was quoted. He says that you should not discriminate on the basis of color. That's him, Watson. There are many people of color who are very talented but don't promote them when they haven't succeeded at a lower level. That's a pretty dumb thing to say, right? I mean, he has a reputation for being politically incorrect, deliberately, to be provocative, but this is really kind of silly. He paid the price. He used to be Chancellor of Cold Spring Harbor. He's been fired. He no longer is. Serves him right, because that was, he was kind of stupid. But I want to focus on the last part of his sentence. He says, he writes, "There's no firm reason to anticipate that the intellectual capacities of peoples geographically separated in their evolution should prove to have evolved identically. Our wanting to reserve equal powers of reason as some universal heritage of humanity will not be enough to make it so." So this set off a firestorm of controversy in the blogosphere and in some other places, leading to discussions about, are there human races? And if there are human races, can they differ in characteristics like intelligence and things like that? And some of the things that were said were really quite silly. It's clear that even amongst well-educated people, understanding of evolution is not at the level that it should be. And it's not that hard. Half an hour from now, you're going to understand enough about what evolution is to be able to address questions like this. Is that reasonable? Are there human races, and is it reasonable that they would differ in genetic characteristics? So maybe we'll come back to that in the question period. But those are the sorts of things that can be clarified if you understand what evolution is. So what is evolution? Even some scientists are a little bit confused about the precise definition of biological evolution. So what we're trying to do is to define here biological evolution as opposed to any other kinds of evolution. Stars evolve, for example, but that's not biological evolution. And so there's a very famous scientist called Douglas Futuyma. He writes a book called Evolution. This is the most widely used evolutionary biology textbook. What he says is true. Okay, so I'm going to read through it. Okay, bear with me when we read on the slide. You're not supposed to do this in slide presentation, but we're going to do it anyway. So biological or organic evolution is a change in the properties of populations of organisms or groups of such populations over the course of many generations. Development or ontology of an individual organism is not evolution. Okay? Individual organisms don't evolve. The changes in populations that are considered evolutionary are those that are heritable by the genetic material from one generation to the next. Biological evolution may be slight, may be substantial. It embraces everything from slight changes in the proportion of different forms of a gene within a population, like, for instance, different blood types in different populations. North American Indians, for Native Americans, for example, have different frequencies of blood types than groups living in Africa or Australia or Europe. That's an example of evolution. Such as the alleles that determine the different blood types. to the alterations that led from the earliest organisms of dinosaurs, bees, snapdragons, and humans. Big picture evolution. So that's a little bit obtuse, and I don't think you are going to remember that, so let's work through it and see if we can simplify it to something that we can all understand. One of the key words here is populations. It's populations evolve, not individuals. It's groups of organisms that change over a period of time. Let's look at this famous giraffe example. Okay? So we were asking if giraffes have evolved long necks. We're not asking whether a single giraffe was all of a sudden born with a long neck. That's not an example of evolution. It's only evolution if the characteristics of the species change. That is, the average neck length in giraffe changes over a period of time. All giraffes have long necks. That's the population that's evolving. So over a long period of time, you start with presumably ancestral giraffes that had short necks. You end up after thousands and thousands of years with giraffes that have long necks. It's the whole population that's changing. You're not looking at one individual. It has to be a population that's evolving. So what is a population? Well, it's a large group of interbreeding individuals. Groups of individuals that are exchanging genes with each other, so that the genes will eventually pass through the entire pool of individuals, obviously from parents to offspring, but then the offsprings will breed with other groups, and so the group of interbreeding organisms is a biologically defined as a population, and that's what evolves. It evolves as the variants, the genetic variants within that population change. Now, it's worth pausing here to talk about what a population is, because it can be a little bit confusing. So in the case of giraffes, I'm sort of implying that the entire species is a single population. And that may be actually true in the case of giraffes. I really don't know, but it's not true in the case of a lot of other organisms. There are lots of examples of species that are made up of many populations or subspecies or races, or the real scientific word is deme, D-E-M-E. So those are populations within a species. So here's an example of Canada geeses. Okay? Here's two of them, and they're different. They look different, and they're different races. In this particular case, they're actually given different species name, but most people recognize that that's probably false, and they're different races. And for each of these two groups, this Atlantic Canada goose and the Richardson Canada goose, there are at least half a dozen subgroups that are readily identified. You have to be a birder to tell the difference, but it depends on things like, how tall they are, how long their neck is, how long their legs are, the coloring on their back, and the coloring around the base of their neck. Sometimes they have a little white stripe. They're all the same species. They all interbreed quite readily, but they're subdivided into various races, subpopulations, or subspecies. Those are the populations that are evolving. And clearly they're different, right? Because they have different characteristics. Each group has a different characteristic. So that means that the flow of genes between the various groups is restricted. They can interbreed, but it's a restricted flow. So it's a kind of a bottleneck. So you have this group over here that's interbreeding, this group over here that's interbreeding. Every now and then there's a little bit of crossover, but not free flow of genes. So the populations are, in a very real sense, evolving independently, and it's readily detectable. You can do the DNA analysis, etc. So the population then is the group of freely interbreeding organisms. Now, sometimes it gets really complicated. Here's lions and tigers. Lion in the upper left-hand corner, tiger in the lower right-hand corner. Two species, right? No. Okay, not really. They've been separated for so long, and they interbreed so rarely that we're going to call them species. But when they're in captivity, they do interbreed, and they interbreed to produce tigons if the father is a tiger, and a liger if the father is a lion. Okay? And there's no impediment, and the hybrids will interbreed. So these are not genetically distinct populations. They're separated by various characteristics and an environment, so that we call them separate species, but their populations have been separated that just don't exchange genes in the wild for any significant length of time. So it gets very confusing So the idea of what is a species and what is a population and what is a race and what is a deme is very confusing. That's what biology is all about. Biology is messy and confusing. It's not neat and tidy like some other things. And I keep telling my daughter, biology is much harder than physics. Way harder than physics. You got nice little laws like relativity and stuff like that that will solve all of your problems. We don't have any of those laws. Okay? There isn't any definition, including the ones I'm about to give you, that don't have exceptions. So you say, in biology, such and such and such and such, except for this and that, and then when you look at this and maybe there and whatever. But biology is very, very messy topic, which is, of course, gleefully exploited by the anti-evolutionists. So let's go back to this definition again. It's a very long definition. Look at the other important characteristic, heritable. So in order for it to be evolution, it has to be there has to be a genetic component. The genes have to be different. So we all have different variants of genes. So you have a single gene for blood type, for example. Okay? And within the population, there are many variants of that gene for blood type A, O, and B, for example. And there are actually subvariants even within that. So those variants, it's the frequencies, it's the amount of those various variants within the population that's changing over time, and that's what evolution is all about. But it has to be a genetic component. So here's the minimal scientific definition of evolution. Evolution is a process that results in heritable changes in a population spread over many generations. Pretty simple. Okay? So just learn that. That's what evolution is. So from now on, whenever you're debating or discussing anything, this is what we're talking about. This is what scientists are talking about when we talk about evolution. It's also what everybody else should be talking about when we're talking about evolution. And that's it. Don't load this definition up with anything else. That's all that's required for a minimal definition of evolution. And why do we want to have a minimal definition? Because we want to decide whether some things are really truly examples of evolution or not. Notice that I've incorporated the concept then of populations. Evolution takes place in a population. The concept of genetic change. And then I added spread out over many generations. Or it's not entirely my version of the definition. It's a composite. Because we don't really want to say the human race is evolving every time a new baby is born. That's a little silly. Okay? So we really want to talk about over a period of generations or a period of time. Is there any net change in the genetic characteristics of the population? So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that there's all kinds of other definitions out there that make no sense whatsoever. And here's a particularly egregious one. This is the Oxford Science Dictionary, an authority that you would think should be reliable. And what they say evolution is, it's the gradual process by which the present diversity of plant and animal life arose from the earliest and most primitive organisms believed to have continued in the last 3 million. That's not a definition. First of all, what about bacteria, fungi, protists? Do they not evolve? So it's a stupid, ridiculous definition. What they're really talking about is a little bit about the history of life. So they're saying the history of life on Earth is a process, has been demonstrated by showing that plants and animals arose from primitive organisms for 3 million years. But that's not the definition of evolution. That's not going to help us decide whether something is evolution or whether something isn't evolution. And that's what definitions are supposed to do. So the problem we face is not only from our anti-science enemies, even our friends don't get it right. And then of course if you look at the standard dictionaries, Chambers, Webster's, those sorts of things, Chambers said evolution, the doctrine according to which higher forms of life have gradually risen out of lower. And that just makes people like me shudder. And first of all, doctrine, higher, we don't say higher and lower. It says nothing about evolution at all. doesn't help us decide anything about evolution. For Webster's, the development of a species organism, the development of an organism, ruled out. That's not evolution. Or organ, a liver, evolves from its original or primitive state to its present or specialized state. Phylogeny or ontogeny, ontogeny is ruled out. So what's with these? I mean, you sort of picture, at this university we have a seminar, a research program for second year students. It's called Research Opportunity Program, and one of them is writing a dictionary. So they have second year students come in and they help, and they sit around a table and start defining words and incorporating them. So it's the dictionary project. It's the Oxford Dictionary Project, as it turns out. And I imagine that's what happened here. A bunch of second year philosophy students or nursing students or engineers sat down and said, what is evolution? Hey, I think I know what it is. Hey, why don't we ask a scientist? No, that's not ask a scientist. I mean, geez, it was kind of that. So they come up with these really stupid definitions. All they had to do was phone and get a reasonable definition. This is the sort of thing that we face when we're trying to explain evolution. Every time we talk to an audience of non-scientists, we're talking different languages. We don't know what definitions they're thinking about, because all these ones are out here. So, if we can come up with a scientific definition of evolution, like the one I just showed you, this one, okay, then we can start to ask questions that will let us decide whether something. Let me give you an example. So Europeans have increased in height over the last 500 years by a lot of different criteria. The average height of people of European descent has gone up over the past. Is that an example of evolution? Okay. Well, we have a definition, so we test it against the definition. Is it a population? Yep, it's definitely a population, right? It's a group of people who share certain characteristics and interbreed rather freely, more freely in the 60s than they did in the 30s. But is it a heritable change? That's the key thing. So here's a living histogram of distribution of height. This happens to be from more than 100 years ago. It's a group of cadets in a school in Austria who lined themselves up according to their height. Okay? And here's what the actual histogram looks like. So you can see that there's a broad distribution of height within any group of people. Just look in this audience, lots of people of different height. We know that there's two components to that variation. There's definitely a hereditary component. It's definitely true that tall parents tend to have tall children, and short parents tend to have short children. It's not as easy as physics, okay? It's more complicated. Sometimes short parents have tall children, tall parents, okay, whatever, because it's a multi-gene sort of phenomenon. But there's definitely a genetic component involved. By the way, here's what the class of the 1970s looks like, reproducing that living histogram. You know it's the 1970s by looking at their clothes. This is not 2007. This is definitely a 70s kind of picture. So there's a lot of variation. Is the increase in height then in Europeans over the last 500 years an example of evolution or not? No, it doesn't appear to be. You can account for it mostly by improvements in nutrition. So there's environmental changes that are not hereditary. There's no known height genes that have really been identified, so we can't really hone in and ask have they changed, but it certainly doesn't look like it's possible. And also, that's a pretty short time for a significant evolutionary change of a polygenic characteristic, one that has contributed by many, many genes. So, no, knowing what evolution is supposed to be, we can probably say this is not an example of evolution. What is an example of evolution? How about antibiotic resistance in bacteria? Is that an example of evolution? Yeah, it is. Okay, here's a bunch of bacteria planted on a petri dish that contains some antibiotic, and these guys are growing very happily, and these guys aren't doing so well. And within a population, there are variants, some of which are resistant and some of which aren't. Here's the variants of all different colors here after selection. You treat them with the drug, and all the ones that are non-resistant die. And the ones that are resistant survive. Okay? And then they multiply and grow, so eventually you transform the population from this state where there was lots of variation to this state where there's much less variation and they're all resistant to the drug. So as long as you keep the drug around, then this population of bacteria has evolved to become drug resistant. And you know that this is a serious problem in hospitals. There are multi-drug resistant bacteria. But by our minimal definition of evolution, this is evolution. It fits all the criteria, and of course it's an example of evolution. So the minimal scientific definition of evolution, again, is the process that results in heritable changes in the population spread out over many generations. The quiz is coming up. Pay attention. Does everybody agree with this definition? Do all biological, all science biologists agree with this definition? Not quite. There's a little bit of controversy, but it comes mostly from people who study. So this definition really describes what's called microevolution. It's evolution on the population level, changes within a population, that sort of small-scale evolution within a population. And that's termed microevolution. And there's a whole field devoted to the study of the mechanism of how these changes occurred called population genetics. So we have some very elaborate theories and equations to describe how various genes and things change within populations. Microevolution, yes.
This definition applies to biological evolution, but the term evolution itself has a much broader.
Yes, exactly right. So this is the minimal definition because it describes the least amount of things that have to happen in order to call it evolution. There are many biologists who really aren't interested in this level at all. They're paleontologists, for example, are interested in a scale that's much larger. They're really looking at large phenotypic changes over millions and millions of years. And that's a field that we call macroevolution. So it's a different level of evolution. It's not just more of this, or it could be just more of this, but there are lots of other things going on. And macroevolution is a different kind of field. So they're not happy with this kind of definition because, if you're out hunting fossils trying to prove that birds evolved from dinosaurs, you're not looking at any genes, and you're looking at single fossils, you don't know about populations. So they're not happy with this kind of definition, and they prefer to think in a different kind of scale. But eventually, when you sit down and talk and try to work things out, we'll all agree that this is the minimal definition. This is what has to happen. And even if you're looking at evolution on a large scale, on a macro scale, this is happening underneath all those major changes. So it's the acceptable definition of evolution, with the caveat that a lot of people aren't really interested in that level of evolution. So lots of people tend to think of evolution as descent with modification. So if you're a field biologist or you're a paleontologist, you're looking at a bigger scale, you tend to think of evolution as being descent with modification. It's a colloquial term. Most people who work at this level, even though we all use this as a sort of slang for evolution, understand that it's not a rigorous definition of evolution. Right? So here's an example of evolution of modern whales, for instance, from primitive carnivores that lived 50, 60 million years ago, a lineage or descent which has been fairly well worked out over the last 20 years or so. And it's an example of sort of evolution on that kind of scale, where changes in the frequencies of variance within a population just doesn't play into this kind of thing. But descent with modification can't be a rigorous definition because it applies to all sorts of things that aren't really biological, and it doesn't really have a solid genetic component to it even. So it's not rigorous in the sense that it deals with populations. It doesn't deal with genetics. Here's descent with modification of corvettes. They don't have the 66 Corvette. How many of you remember Route 66? Anyway, not many. The other problem is that the definition of evolution has to be different than the mechanism of evolution. So we're defining evolution, but we don't want to define it in terms of how it happens. So for example, Darwinism, the famous word that's used by creationists, which in modern biological terms describes people who are wedded to natural selection as almost an exclusive explanation of everything. But natural selection, for example, is not part of the scientific definition of evolution. The definition has to be neutral with respect to mechanism. It could be Lamarckian evolution, it could be natural selection that's causing the changes. And we have to keep a definition open to all those various possibilities. Nowadays, of course, there are many other mechanisms of evolution besides natural selection. Random genetic drift is the major one. And so the frequencies of variance within a population can change just by random assortment. The idea that some Native American tribes, particularly in Western North America, have almost exclusively O-type blood and no A variants and no B variants. The variants are called alleles, by the way. So a gene will have many different variants, and each variant is called an allele. So there's the A allele, the B allele, the O allele of the blood type, or the blood group gene. It's not reasonable to imagine that for some reason those Native Americans living in the western part of the continent are at some selective advantage because they have O-type blood, or that the A-type blood or B-type blood